Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Raymond Patriarca, the man who united and ruled New England's underworld for decades. Known for his quiet strength and sharp mind, Patriarca built his influence not through chaos, but through control, discipline, and respect. To some, he was a fair leader who valued order. To others, a man whose authority reached every corner of the Northeast. Before we begin, like this video, we're aiming for 100 likes in this video. And here's something important. Over 90% of our viewers watch these stories but haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy what we do, please subscribe and join our family. It truly helps us grow and keeps these powerful stories alive. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to keep bringing you more fascinating stories. Now, close your eyes and imagine the streets of Providence after dark, the soft hum of distant traffic, and the quiet command of a man who ruled with calm precision. Settle in and let the story of Raymond Patriarca guide you into the night. Raymond Patriarca was born in Worcester in 1908 to an immigrant family that did what immigrants do. Work early, work late, then fall asleep at the kitchen table. Money was tight and every season brought a new hustle peddling fruit, laboring at mills, whatever kept the rent paid. When the family moved to Providence's Federal Hill, the neighborhood's rhythm shaped him. Vendors shouted from push carts, church bells marked time, and adults spoke softly about which corners to avoid. Children notice what gets people fed and what gets them hurt. He noticed both, and he learned to keep his face neutral. Prohibition was a teacher for a lot of young men in that era. With liquor illegal and demand endless, doors opened for messengers, drivers, lookouts. He did small things first, the kind of favors that let older men test a kid's nerve. You show up on time. You say little. You don't gawk when someone important walks by. He understood very quickly that the quickest way to advance wasn't swagger but steadiness. He wasn't the strongest, but he endured. He wasn't the loudest, but he listened. The police knew his name early. Arrests came with that world robbery here, a bootlegging case there, fights that started with a stare and ended in a station house. He was locked up more than once in his 20s and 30s. Each time out, he returned to Federal Hill lighter in pocket but heavier in knowledge. He took note of which guards had families to support, which detectives liked to brag, which lawyers never promised more than they could deliver. He wasn't the kind to boast after a release. He kept his head down and studied how money actually moved. If liquor had taught him speed, the machines taught him patience. Cigarette vending and jukebox routes looked boring from the curb, but they put metal boxes in bars, diners, and garages all over the region. With every box came a relationship, a bit of leverage, and a reason to stop by weekly. Legitimate and illegitimate money started to share the same envelopes. By the 1,940 seconds, he had interest tied to these routes, and he saw how a tidy front could keep attention from the cash that really mattered. Gambling, loan services at frightening interest, and collection work that made delinquency rare. He cultivated a reputation for paying his bills and for expecting others to do the same. The New England underworld had long been tied to Boston, where powerful figures ran things from the North End. But the winds shifted after World War II. Older bosses left, retired, or were pushed aside. In the early 1,950 seconds, a transition opened space. By the mid-1,950 seconds, with a nod from people who mattered well beyond Rhode Island, he became the one who decided who answered to whom in the region. From that point, crews from Providence to Boston to outlying towns paid tribute to the same desk on Atwell's Avenue, and he enforced a simple order. No one moved on big things without a green light, and revenue flowed upward on schedule. He built a headquarters that fit his way of doing things. Nothing flashy, a working office behind a vending company's door. People sat, began sentences slowly, and waited for his reply. He ran his world like a small business. Daily hours, a ledger, coffee on the same burner. He remembered birthdays and grudges, never drank on the job, and preferred to see a man once rather than hear about him 3 times. If he gave a warning, you didn't get a second. He didn't run to violence first. That sort of chaos drew eyes. But he ran a criminal organization, and in that world, threats and killings happened. When someone was labeled a problem, an informer, a thief from the wrong till, an obstinate bookmaker, people got hurt or disappeared. He shaped the policy but kept his public face calm. as steady as a store owner ordering inventory. He had lieutenants with their own spheres. In Boston, the Angulo brothers held wait for him for years, overseeing gambling, bookmaking, and collections across neighborhoods crowded with competition. Outside the North End, Irish crews also operated, and relationships formed where they had to. Alliances and truces were practical, not sentimental. He valued predictability above bravado, which meant he wanted everyone, Irish or Italian, to keep the peace as long as payments stayed regular. This kept things quieter than in other cities, with fewer headlines and more steady income. His business bouquet was the usual for an outfit of that era. Illegal gambling brought in cash daily, policy numbers, horse bets, card games where the house always got its rake. Loan sharking turned desperation into guaranteed returns. He expected names on lists, not beats on the street, and he had men who knew how to collect without putting stories in newspapers. Protection fees kept problems away from bars and clubs that handled his machines. Truck hijacks and the handling of stolen goods cropped up when opportunities arose. Labor racketeering at docks and on construction projects meant contracts went where they were told to go, and the money from those jobs returned in envelopes. Politicians and officials were not immune to influence. Favors flowed in both directions. Jobs promised, problems softened, inspections delayed, charges reduced. None of this was new to American cities. He was simply effective at keeping it organized. Appalachian in 1957, when a countryside lawman stumbled onto a gathering of bosses in upstate New York, changed how Washington looked at organized crime. The FBI, slow to acknowledge the scale of it all, began pressing harder. Attention like that forced him to get even quieter. He avoided pageantry, avoided crowds, avoided photographs. He relied on a small circle and kept his travels limited. He made Providence the safe harbor, with law enforcement close enough to watch and far enough to read only what he showed them. The carefulness worked for a time. Where other cities bled in turf wars, New England's conflicts were often settled by phone before blood spilled. He did not like headlines. He liked steady revenue. When tempers flared, he brokered talks through trusted intermediaries. When a crew got ambitious, he clipped privileges instead of lives. Unless lives were the only currency a rival understood. He required discipline in how people spoke, how they handled money, how they handled anger. But crimes don't stay hidden forever. Through the 1,960 seconds, state police and federal agents put pressure on his world. They leaned on bookmakers, flipped drivers, watched office doors from unmarked cars. They worked informants into rooms and tried what would later ignite years of legal fights. Microphones hidden in places they had no warrant to enter. Bugs picked up conversations about debts, payoffs, and the worst of it, murder plans. He had kept his language measured for years, yet the tape recorder does not care how quiet you sound. He was charged in the late 1,960 seconds in connection with a killing that shook Providence's gambling world, a case built in part on recordings from inside his office. Prosecutors said he approved the move, that his consent set the act in motion, and a jury agreed. He faced a conspiracy conviction, the kind of verdict that underscored how a man who rarely left his chair could still be held responsible for violence carried out by others. Years later, appellate courts would scrutinize how the government had gathered evidence, tossing parts out because of how the microphones had been planted. The legal fights didn't make him innocent. They made certain kinds of proof unusable. For him, these battles meant stretches behind bars and then returns to that same desk, older and a bit thinner, but still stubbornly in charge. He had ailments that years of stress make worse heart trouble, the kind that left him tired by late afternoon. He conserved energy the way he conserved words. An oxygen tank sometimes sat at his side, hissing softly while he heard out visitors. Even sick, he expected order. Business kept moving. Gambling, loans, protection, skims from construction and union contracts, deals with nightclub owners, arrangements with crooked brokers who knew how to move cash with fewer fingerprints. He kept a hand in the appointment of captains, in the arbitration of disputes, in the blessing or veto of anything big. The law called his world a criminal enterprise, and he would not have argued with the label privately. He knew exactly what he ran and what it took to keep it alive. He saw himself as a manager of men who had chosen that life, a referee who kept chaos from ruining the take. But every accounting sheet in that room was stained by the ways the money came in. Victims of intimidation were real. Families who lost someone to a decision made in that office were real. Business owners who paid because they had no real choice. Workers who watched their unions corrupted, gamblers who borrowed themselves into a trap. It all lived downstream of his measured voice. If you stood on Federal Hill in those years, you'd see the double life. In public, he wore an old man's cardigan and walked the block with a neighborly nod. Street side, he looked like a retiree minding a small firm. Behind the door, he weighed the fate of careers and sometimes lives. He chastised subordinates for showing off, quizzed them on numbers, told them to stop drawing heat. He did not lecture about honor. He lectured about timing. He carved out a set of rules that suited him. Get permission. Pay tribute. Keep calm. Don't bring strangers. Don't brag. Don't improvise. Be civil. Be punctual. Be profitable. People who crossed him didn't always get a second chance. Some were expelled from rackets, cut off from bookmakers, frozen out by bartenders who liked their front windows intact. Others met darker ends. He didn't swing the bat, but in that world, he didn't have to. Approval was enough. A nod could mean a man's business was over. A different nod could mean the man was over. The more carefully he spoke, the more quietly those decisions landed. He lasted because his style matched New England's temperament. Reserved, stubborn, practical. He didn't relocate to Florida and crow about sunshine. He stayed in Providence, winter to winter. He didn't chase Hollywood glamour. He ran routes, totals, and meetings with the clockwork of a clerk. In a century that glamorized gangsters, he kept glamour out of the office and profit inside it. That discipline day after day, year after year, let him build something that outlived prohibition, outlived two flashy peers, and even outlived him for a time. By the end of the 1,960 seconds, the walls were closing in, not from rivals, but from lawmen. Informants like Joseph Barboza in Boston told tales that rippled back to Providence, implicating capos and associates, and setting off trials that sent men away for long stretches. Some of those cases would later unravel when courts examined the government's conduct. Others would stick. He had always relied on loyalty enforced by fear and habit. Now loyalty was being auctioned for reduced sentences. He adjusted as best he could, applying the same cold arithmetic he always used. Replace this man with that one, tighten that route, move a meeting here, cancel another there, talk less, write even less, and never, ever allow the drama to become public theater. Through it all, the routine stayed. The door, the memory for names and debts, the slow sip of coffee. The crimes were not glamorous, and the harm they did was not abstract. He kept collecting on gambling. He kept ordering loans. He kept skimming contracts. He kept using union influence to steer work. He kept paying off the right people to keep the gears turning. People got threatened. Businesses got shaken down. Competitors vanished or were removed from the map. He ran an outfit that did what outfits do. They extract money, and they make the extraction feel inevitable. In that small office in Providence, surrounded by the hum of a vending firm that gave him cover, an aging boss considered each day like a chessboard. He measured risk, guarded his king, sacrificed pawns when necessary, and never forgot that real power often looks like nothing at all from the sidewalk. Long after closing time, he'd sometimes sit alone, the street outside quiet, Providence lights blinking red to green and back again. He had built a criminal order on patience and fear. He knew it couldn't last forever, but he intended to make it last as long as he breathed. The office lamp glowed like a moon on a desk blotter, and for a long minute no one talked. Outside, traffic sighed through Federal Hill, past bakeries closing their doors and men chatting in doorways. Inside, the phone waited. He stared at it the way a chess player stares at a clock, knowing one call could move money, cancel a plan, or save a man from a bad decision. A cough, a sip of coffee, a pen placed parallel to a lined pad. He didn't hurry anyone, didn't lean on words. He let the room grow quiet enough that a visitor could hear his own heartbeat and reconsider a risky scheme. When the ring finally came, it was a soft electric chirp, the sound of authority being exercised with no announcement. By the time he set the handset down, a route was reassigned. Two egos were cooled, and one dispute would end with a handshake instead of sirens. He had made a life out of turning tempers into timetables. In the early 1,950 seconds, he shifted from ambitious earner to the figure everyone else checked with before doing anything big. Philip Bucola, who had long presided over the New England rackets largely from Boston, slipped away to Italy under pressure. The structure he left behind needed someone steady to keep payments regular and territories clear. That role fell to the Providence man with the ledger. He moved the locust south, turned Federal Hill into the nerve center, and gave Boston's Angiulo brothers a portfolio with boundaries. They handled day-to-day Boston operations, bookmaking, casino nights, protection, collections, while tribute traveled on schedule to Providence. In Worcester, Springfield, Hartford, and smaller mill towns, longtime bookmakers and new faces learned the same lesson. There was one arbiter now, and he sat behind a plain desk on Atwell's Avenue. The money streams weren't glamorous. Numbers, writers, and barbershops took wagers for the daily draw. Tavern owners ran card games in back rooms where the house took a small, reliable percentage. Horse bettors called runners who knew which phones to use and which to avoid. Every week, cigarette and jukebox routes came due at bars, diners, union halls, garages. The machines looked innocent, but they guaranteed reasons for regular visits, quiet conversations, and influence whenever an establishment needed help or feared a problem. Loans short-term, high interest filled the gaps when a gambler ran past his limit or a business owner fell behind. Collection was firm, but when things went right, not dramatic. Making examples drew headlines, and headlines drew heat. Truck hijacking, stolen goods, and skims from construction jobs appeared when opportunity smiled. Control of certain union locals meant contractors learned to return phone calls and share profits. And if a shipping firm needed a problem solved on a dock, it got solved for a fee. He cultivated relationships beyond street crews, fixers who knew courthouse schedules, ward leaders who could stall an inspection or move a permit, brokers who could turn cash into cashier's checks, and then into something even less traceable. Nothing about these exchanges looked cinematic. It looked like an old city functioning with a second set of rules that only a few people acknowledged. His rule set valued punctual envelopes, polite voices, and a clear chain of responsibility. He rewarded consistency, not flash. People who brought chaos lost privileges, then income, and if they kept pushing, they lost more than that. The 1957 fiasco at Appalachian, when a small-town patrolman stumbled onto a countryside meeting of bosses, changed the national conversation. Even those who had resisted the idea of a national structure had to accept the obvious. Washington woke up, newspapers learned new names, and federal agents who had called men like him hoodlums in private memos started building longer files with more attention to detail. He responded by getting even more careful. He didn't fly to big gatherings. He kept his social circle tight, his movements local, and his procedures regular. The office on Atwell's became both headquarters and fortress, a place where he could control who entered, who spoke, and how long they stayed. Boston needed special attention because its streets had long-standing Irish crews as well as Italian outfits. He didn't prosecute ancient neighborhood resentments, he counted receipts. Through the early 1962s, rival Irish factions feuded Somerville figures tied to Winter Hill, battled Charlestown men close to the McLaughlin Group. He wanted the noise turned down. He expected his Boston representatives to deliver that quiet. When truces failed, he authorized limited correction, always reminding subordinates that uncontrolled violence would bring investigators to every doorstep. Behind the scenes, he brokered understanding with leaders on both sides of the divide. Calm returned not because people forgave each other, but because they understood there would be costs for breaking the rhythm of business. He tried to wall his men off from narcotics. He understood what those profits looked like, but he also understood the heat that came with them. Publicly, he forbade that line of trade. Privately, he punished anyone who mixed his routes with heroin money without permission. Still, some did it anyway, and the fallout landed in court under someone's name. He didn't pretend morality in this. It was a calculation. Gambling and loans drew predictable attention and delivered predictable fines. Narcotics cases tore apart organizations and turned earners into witnesses. One of the most volatile earners of that decade, a hitman with a reputation for fearlessness, started under the organization's umbrella and then flipped to the government, Joseph Barboza. He had worked the darkest assignments for Boston captains, then sought protection and favors when federal charges loomed. In 1967, he became a star witness, giving testimony that lit up courtrooms and newspaper columns. His stories pulled Boston's leadership into courtrooms, and placed blame for killings on men up the ladder. Some convictions that grew out of that testimony would later collapse after judges determined that key facts had been hidden or twisted. Other counts stuck. What mattered to the office on Atwell's was that a veteran enforcer from their larger orbit had become a government tool, and that the FBI had learned how to turn insiders into storytellers. Rhode Island police and federal agents pursued a different tactic as well. They wanted to hear the planning as it happened. Investigators, working without the kind of judicial authorization later required, planted microphones in places they never should have entered. Covert recordings captured pieces of conversation in that vending company office, snatches of bargaining over debts, mentions of payoffs, and, most damning, talk about violent solutions to specific problems. Those tapes energized prosecutors who had long believed that the calm man behind the desk approved major acts without lifting a hand himself. The most consequential case of that period grew from a feud over gambling territory in Providence. Two men, Rudolph Rudy Marfeo, a bookmaker with his own ideas about who needed to be asked for permission, and Anthony Mele, a friend tied into the same circles, became targets after a series of disputes. Prosecutors would later say the boss gave a green light to remove them. In 1968, Marfeo and Mele were shot dead in Providence. The details splashed across local headlines, and pressure mounted on every known associate of the office. The state built a conspiracy case against the man on Atwell's, using witnesses and giving jurors a taste of the office's taped conversations. He was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, a verdict that sent the clearest message yet. Even a leader who rarely left his chair could be held responsible for the violence that followed his directives. He went to prison, an older man with a bad heart. The sentence bit not just because of time in a cell, but because a routine he had perfected for decades now ran through bars and visiting rooms. Even confined, he kept a rhythm. He read reports, made decisions through intermediaries, and replaced those who had flipped with men who understood the honor system he ran. Do the job, keep your head, and stay off front pages. He relied on lieutenants whose loyalty had been tempered by years of working under his rules, Boston's Jerry Angulo chief among them, to keep money moving and disputes settled. His lawyers attacked the state's case piece by piece, and time worked in his favor. In the early 1970 seconds, higher courts, reviewing the methods used by police to plant and monitor microphones, concluded that much of that evidence had been gathered unlawfully. Rhode Island's Supreme Court, examining the Marfeo divided by Mele matter, found that key recordings had been made in violation of constitutional protections, and the conviction was overturned. That decision didn't declare him innocent of the plots alleged. It declared the state's proof tainted. After years of custody and court battles, he returned to Providence, slimmer and tired, but not finished. The oxygen tank that sometimes hissed beside him said a lot about his health. The steady gaze said even more about his resolve. His absence had taught subordinates two lessons. First, that the enterprise could run on procedures he set long before his arrest. Fixed meeting days, a strict need for permission on big moves, envelopes counted and logged, respect shown to neutral spaces like churches and family gatherings. Second, that any lapse in discipline would be punished, because prison had only hardened his insistence on order. He reduced the number of people who could walk into his office without an appointment. He slashed casual visits. He used intermediaries for almost everything, leaving very few fingerprints and even fewer recordings. He advised lieutenants to move meetings to noisy spaces, busy diners, city parks, waterfront lots where stray microphones would capture nothing but gulls, traffic, and forks on plates. He paid more attention than ever to paperwork that didn't look like paperwork. A contractor might receive a reminder that certain materials needed to be ordered from a particular distributor. A club owner might learn that installing new machines from the vending company on Atwell's would prevent troublesome visits from anyone else. Union officials who had long acted as go-betweens found themselves in a tighter channel, fewer calls, clearer directives, and an ironclad expectation that picket lines, job assignments, and benefit funds would be handled in ways that helped friends and punished the stubborn. Where others believed intimidation required a spectacle, he preferred an audit's quiet cruelty. A dock slowed by a misunderstanding, a delivery deferred by a paperwork error, a scheduled inspection that arrived exactly when a rival could least afford it. He also took politics seriously, in the local sense of the word. Providence was a small city with long memories. He remembered favors done years earlier and collected calmly. He never chased public office, never posed with would-be kingmakers, but he understood ward maps. If someone needed help on a zoning question, someone else expected a meeting to happen on a different matter. He didn't buy entire departments. He bought time. And time is what saved him again and again. Time to move a meeting. Time to quietly move someone out of state. Time to let a scandal fade. Despite every measure he took, the late 1,960 seconds and early 1,970 seconds had shown him something he couldn't unsee. Informants were the real fuse. Barbossa's crusade had cost him trusted captains, and other turncoats followed. The FBI learned to cultivate grudges and fears, to whisper about sentences and families, to promise relocations and fresh starts. He responded by shrinking circles further, and by rewarding men who could live lean and keep quiet. In Boston, Angiulo acted as the daily face of the organization, coordinating bookmaking, loans, and protection in the North End and beyond. In Rhode Island, captains such as Henry Tamaleo, at one point a high-ranking figure before his own conviction in a controversial Boston murder case, either went away or were replaced, and he stacked roles with men who had more to lose by talking than by serving time. The law also changed its tools. Congress passed statutes that prosecutors wielded against entire organizations rather than just individuals. In response, he changed the way money moved. Cash got separated into smaller packets, run through more hands before arriving in Providence. He leaned harder on legitimate fronts: vending companies, service businesses, property holdings. Records reflected simple transactions, refills, repairs, deliveries, while the real agreements lived in conversations that never named what they meant. Quiet money went into quiet real estate. He preferred row houses and mixed-use storefronts to mansions. Property managers could be loyal if they were paid properly and left alone. He found new ways to skim construction, a perennial source of profit in growing suburbs. If a developer wanted a project to move without costly delays, certain subcontractors had to be chosen. Those subcontractors paid for the privilege. If a builder balked, items went missing, or trucks arrived late, or a picket appeared with signs about wages and benefits. The demonstration ended when the builder remembered how schedules get respected. On the docks, shipping firms learned that stevedores who belonged to particular locals made ship turnarounds faster, and faster meant money. Those locals supported leadership who took his calls. It didn't look like a stick-up, it looked like logistics. His health turned every winter into a negotiation with his own body. Angina, exhaustion, and later, a more serious heart condition made afternoons shorter. The oxygen tank was never far away. Yet even in a cardigan, moving slower, he kept the tone of the room where it needed to be. Visitors sat a little straighter. Younger men, eager for his approval, learned the old rules before they learned the slang on the street. He corrected them when they used names instead of nicknames, looked annoyed when anyone showed off cash, rolled his eyes if someone bragged about a fight. He wanted earners, not brawlers. He wanted lists, not legends. His family life stayed largely away from headlines. He'd walk short blocks in Federal Hill, like a quiet neighbor, nodding to grocers and bakers. His son grew into the orbit that surrounded him, learning how attention felt and how silence worked. To outsiders, the idea of family succession felt inevitable. Inside, it wasn't romance, just practicality. An heir who already understood the rules meant fewer explanations when the time came. He had always prized predictability, but he wasn't blind to change. State lotteries began to eat into the numbers business. He adapted, taking a cut from those who provided the old product to loyal customers who preferred familiar routines. He let small operators handle tiny wagers and kept focus on bigger sheets and higher margin loans. Nightclubs changed too, with new owners who thought they could do without neighborhood relationships. Some learned the hard way that city inspectors had long memories and that bouncers made poor diplomats. Agreements returned, with caveats that protected regulars and kept disturbances to a level that wouldn't attract cameras. He still had a hand in choosing who managed what across New England, blessing or blocking promotions with a sentence. If a Springfield crew chief died or went away, he might select a replacement from Worcester rather than from Boston to prevent any single city from gathering too much independence. When a Hartford bookmaker hinted he deserved more, He might hear that Providence didn't think so. He settled fights over routes with a kind of rough fairness. If both sides were wrong, he said so. And no one mistook his tone. Everyone understood that appeals ended at that desk. And that was the point. He was not romantic about what he ran. He understood it as a system that took from others so that those in his orbit got paid. He didn't flatter himself with talk about tradition. He kept accounts. He kept people in line. When a bar owner said he couldn't afford the rate this week, he didn't raise his voice. He adjusted the terms and asked a small favor in return, a referral to a friend who owned a garage, a quiet introduction to a city worker, a bit of information about a competitor. Every favor folded into the bigger ledger. Debts nested inside debts, and after a while, people forgot how to stand outside the network and say no. The past did not disappear just because a court tossed a conviction. Agents kept watching, reporters kept asking, prosecutors tested new approaches, sometimes striking out, sometimes landing a blow that took years to unwind. He answered by staying small in a way that felt almost old-fashioned. He kept his office. He kept his hours. People who wanted to imagine a boss in a mansion weren't going to find one on Federal Hill. They were going to find a veteran clerk who believed in habits. Those habits, nearly clerical, kept the enterprise alive across decades when louder, flashier outfits in other cities tore themselves apart. Men who failed to understand the quiet got themselves in trouble. A young collector who slapped someone in public lost his route and had to ask friends for work. A bookmaker who bragged to a date about knowing famous names found himself reassigned to a colder neighborhood. A driver who got caught with a gun in his glove box found that no one could remember who had asked him to run that errand. He trained his people to imagine the world as a set of gray corridors rather than bright rooms. They learned how to leave a meeting without the waitress remembering a name, how to make a call from a payphone no one else ever used, how to apologize before a conflict turned into a matter that lawyers would argue over for months. Even with all that discipline, he knew the game's core risk never changed. Every operation required other people, and other people could talk. That awareness made him stingier with trust as he aged. He delegated less and verified more, reading body language the way others read headlines. He asked short questions and watched how someone breathed before answering. He judged who could handle pressure by how they stirred coffee. It sounded superstitious to outsiders, but it saved him more than once. He also kept a close eye on changes in law enforcement culture. After the national embarrassment at Appalachian and the revelations that followed, federal agencies invested in long-term cases wire work done with warrants, undercover agents trained to blend into union halls and trucking lots, financial analysts who could trace cash through property purchases. He adapted, not by outpacing technology, but by refusing to supply it with useful material. Fewer names, fewer numbers on paper, more conversations during walks, more decisions made by silence, by a look, by a nod that an observer might misread as nothing at all. By the mid-1970 seconds, people outside the world he managed had begun to mythologize it. Films, paperbacks, clever nicknames for men who never used nicknames for themselves. He ignored all of it. He measured success by quiet. On weeks when the ledger balanced, no one got loud, and envelopes arrived without a reminder. He felt the comfort a shop owner feels when a day closes with the register exact. He had built a criminal machine that disguised itself as routine commerce. The harm it did, the fear, the stolen wages, the families pushed into debt was real and ongoing. He did not pretend otherwise. He considered it the cost of doing business and expected everyone else to see it that way too. So the lamp stayed lit, the phone rang at measured intervals, and Providence nights rolled on. He worked like a man who considered attention an enemy and patience a weapon. The office door closed each evening with the same small click, and for one more day, the man who rarely raised his voice had kept his thumb on a region that learned, year after year, to listen for it. The city moved at a calm pace in the mornings he liked best. Bakery doors swung open, trays of pastries slid into glass cases, coffee steamed, and the sidewalks filled with familiar faces. He preferred those hours for talks that mattered. He would arrive, settle into his chair, take a breath through the hiss of oxygen when he needed it, and listen. Calls came in from Boston, Worcester, Springfield, Hartford, and smaller places with factories and diners where cash changed hands. The same rules guided every conversation. Speak plainly, decide quickly, and leave no loose ends. In the world that formed around his desk, Routine wasn't boring. It was armor. By the early 1970 seconds, he had outlasted the storm that nearly removed him for good. The conspiracy case tied to a pair of killings in Providence had sent him to a cell, but appeals cut it down. Judges rejected recordings captured with methods that crossed legal lines, and he came home. The time away had sharpened his instincts. He reduced the number of people who could get near him, spread responsibility among men who showed patience, and made it clear that anyone who created noise would lose privileges. In an era when new federal laws targeted entire organizations, not just individual suspects, he answered with even tighter discipline. Money flowed through fronts that looked plain to anyone passing by. National Cigarette Service, Coin-O-Matic, a web of small service outfits, and well-chosen properties. Receipts listed refills and repairs. The real agreements lived in brief, careful exchanges that named nothing directly. Boston remained both asset and risk. The Angulo brothers, led by Gennaro, ran the North End and surrounding neighborhoods for him. They oversaw bookmaking sheets, card games, protection deals with bars and clubs, loan collections, and the settling of disputes between earner crews. Their remit had boundaries. They were to collect, coordinate, and keep peace, then send a steady share south to Providence. Irish crews still operated nearby, men from Winter Hill, and other enclaves who handled their own betting lines and side businesses. He didn't seek to erase them. He insisted on predictability. Sit-downs happened when lines crossed. Percentages were agreed upon. The principle never changed. Revenue mattered more than pride. The harm that generated his income took many forms. Bar owners paid to keep trouble away and to keep certain machines in place. Gamblers handed over money on losing streaks and then borrowed at rates that turned a bad week into a long-term burden. Contractors steered subcontracts to approved firms to ensure deliveries arrived and job sites stayed calm. Union officials who controlled hiring and job assignments learned to take calls and to move crews where profits needed to go. Truck hijacks and stolen merchandise appeared when a route looked vulnerable. None of it looked dramatic on the surface, and that was the point. He chose pressure over spectacle, paperwork over public threats. The goal was a city that looked normal, while cash took a quiet detour. His health forced concessions. He was an aging man with heart trouble, often tired by afternoon, often leaning on that tank by his side. Yet visitors, remembering his age, tended to forget it once he started asking questions. He had a memory for street corners and names, a talent for spotting when someone inflated numbers, a way of looking at a man that cut off excuses. A collector who spent too much at nightclubs got reassigned to a modest route. A bookmaker who drew attention with a flashy car was told to sell it. A young enforcer who wanted to build a reputation was reminded that reputations brought investigators. The boss valued earners who blended into the neighborhood, men who clocked in and out like everyone else. Out of Boston came the case that would echo for decades. A Chelsea murder from 1965. Edward "Teddy" Deegan was killed in an alley. And the trials that followed in the late 1960 seconds and early 1970 seconds leaned heavily on the testimony of Joseph Barboza, a violent Boston figure who turned witness when prison loomed. He told jurors that high-ranking men tied to the New England organization ordered Deegan's death. Convictions followed. Years later, courts concluded that federal agents had hidden crucial evidence and that some of the convicted had been innocent, men like Peter Lamone and Louis Greco, who served long stretches for a killing they did not commit. The Deegan affair revealed two truths about the world clustered around the office on Atwell's Avenue. First, that killings were debated and approved in disciplined fashion and rarely without a nod from the top. Second, that the government, in its push to crack these circles, sometimes stepped outside its own rules and left injustice in its wake. The wrongful convictions didn't absolve the wider enterprise of violence. They showed how murky the record could become once informants, ambition, and secrecy tangled together. Barboza himself, having testified and then disappeared under protection, didn't live a quiet life. He was later shot to death in California. Authorities suspected that figures from New England reached across the map to settle accounts, though courtroom proof never wrapped itself neatly around any one person. For the office in Providence, his end felt like a closing chapter from a turbulent decade. It also reinforced the boss's doctrine. If someone left the circle and spoke, the consequences would ripple for years. The federal toolbox grew sharper in the 1970 seconds. New statutes allowed prosecutors to charge patterns of racketeering and to link leaders to crimes committed by subordinates if they could show an enterprise with rules, roles, and profits. He responded by thinning the organizational chart in ways that didn't show on paper. Captains met with fewer men at once. Messages moved through trusted go-betweens who could pass a decision with a sentence. Meetings shifted to places where microphones wouldn't work well. A walk through a crowded market, a bench by a busy road, the far corner of a coffee shop under a loud radio. Inside the office, clocks ticked and the radio murmured, but the real protections were human. Men trained to talk around topics, to signal with small gestures, to avoid saying a name when a nickname or a nod would do. Loans remained a pillar. He did not call them loan sharking. He called them business, and he insisted that they be run with predictability. A gambler down a few thousand by Friday could walk into a back room, sign for cash, and walk out feeling saved. The schedule that followed never changed. Miss a week and the interest compounded. Miss again, and that quiet pressure began. A conversation at the bar, a car that wouldn't start on a cold morning, a whisper to an employer about a worker's reliability. He disfavored brawls, not because he felt mercy, but because brawls made witnesses. Steady unpleasantness achieved the same result and left fewer marks that police could photograph. On job sites and loading docks, his influence showed up as efficiency for friends and friction for those who refused cooperation. A shipping firm that joined the program saw faster turnarounds. A builder who ignored calls encountered sudden shortages or surprise inspection delays. If a manager needed a strike ended, a call went out, hands were shaken, and workers returned with the understanding that their next overtime assignment had already been decided. Unions offered leverage, and he didn't waste it. Leaders who kept channels open were rewarded with help when they faced challenges from rivals. He rejected narcotics trade around his routes, a rule he repeated often. The profits were undeniable, but the attention that followed was worse than any single score. While he forbade involvement, the rule wasn't universal in practice. Some associates on the edges ignored it and brought trouble. When that happened, he separated his operation fast, cutting off contact and reminding others why the rule existed. In meetings, he explained it without pretending morality. Certain products brought a level of scrutiny that could jeopardize every other earner, and that risk wasn't acceptable. The Rhode Island street map became a ledger as much as a grid. With the vending firm as a public face, trucks rolled through the city every day. Stops meant receipts, refills, and short talks about unrelated matters that weren't unrelated at all. Who had been asking questions? Which bar owner complained about a damaged stool and casually mentioned an inspector's name? Which gambler had suddenly changed his habits? He collected information the way other businesses collected payments. In a place where families had known each other for generations, those small details mattered more than any grand gesture. New England's Italian and Irish circles continued to intersect. After the bloody feuds of the early 1960 seconds, Boston's Irish operators mostly learned to keep conflict contained and to share slices with the North End. He wanted them stable, paying on schedule, and silent. If a new Irish boss thought tribute was optional, an intermediary delivered a correction. No bravado, just arithmetic. Do you want to keep this route? Then respect the framework. Over time, predictable money overcame pride, as it usually does. He understood that goodwill could be as useful as fear. During holidays, a turkey might show up at a house where a man carried envelopes every week. When a bar hosted a charity night, a familiar envelope arrived early. These gestures weren't generosity, they were investments. He made a point of remembering who needed a favor and who delivered on one. He also kept lists in his head of men who cut corners and of businesses that tried to play both sides by paying small to him and small to a rival. Those lists informed future decisions that outsiders mistook for chance. The years didn't blunt his sense of accountability. When a killing happened without his say-so, he treated it as a threat to order. He would demand a full explanation, levy fines that hurt, remove territory from a captain who failed to control a hothead, and, if nothing else worked, shut down an entire line of business until people remembered how to act. Violence in his world was a management problem. He gave approvals when he believed they were necessary to keep the machine from shaking apart, but he insisted that even the worst acts follow rules that lowered the chance of headlines. Beyond Providence and Boston, his reach touched mill towns that had seen better days. In Worcester, Springfield, and Lawrence, old neighborhood bookies ran decades-old operations. He protected them when outsiders came in making loud promises. In return, envelopes arrived with quiet regularity. In Hartford and New Haven, where the money mixed with New York influences, he stayed careful, respecting the larger families to the south while guarding his northern borders. Disputes that crossed state lines got solved in rooms where ashtrays filled slowly and men spoke in measured tones. He spent more time in hospitals as the 1,970 seconds progressed, but even there the routine followed him. Visitors were screened. Some updates arrived through family members carrying groceries or magazines. He made calls from payphones on the way home from appointments rather than from the house, a habit so ingrained that people who didn't know him well thought he enjoyed walking. In truth, every step had a purpose. Move, speak briefly, leave nothing to replay. Law enforcement adapted too. Investigators tracked property records and business registrations, looking for patterns that tied small companies to cash-heavy corners. Undercover agents attended union meetings and fishing club dinners. When indictments came, they named not just a single offense, but a pattern of extortion, gambling, and influence. Sometimes those cases stuck. Other times they fell apart when witnesses wavered or when judges found overreach. Each time a case collapsed, he grew quieter, reminding his circle that the next one might be built better. Meanwhile, the Boston arm under Angulo grew powerful enough to draw its own storms. The North End office buzzed with traffic, and the FBI took interest. Investigators spent years hunting for legal ways to listen inside those rooms. That story would explode in the next decade. But in the 1,970 seconds, the old man in Providence watched, cautioned patience, and reminded everyone that the goal was never glory. The goal was Tuesday looking like Monday, envelopes arriving on time, and Providence nights ending with the same faint click of the office door. In private moments, he looked back at the city of his youth and noted what had changed. Prohibition had ended long ago, yet the habits it taught, speed, secrecy, shared risk, still governed his days. New highways had carved up neighborhoods. Families moved out to suburbs. Factories closed. Yet even as the landscape shifted, the engine he built kept humming because it was simple. Control permission, regulate violence, stabilize the money. If someone wanted to open a card room, they checked with him. If a bookmaker wanted to expand into a new corner, he asked permission. If two crews argued about who deserved a piece of a busy bar, they brought the disagreement to his desk instead of to the curb. He understood better than most that his quiet life caused real harm. He had broken laws for decades and taught others to do the same. People paid because they were afraid, or because refusal meant losing business, or because they had slipped into habits they could no longer escape. He didn't cloak that truth in speeches. He accepted it and got on with his day. When he considered legacy, he didn't think about statues or stories. He thought about whether the next generation had learned the rules well enough to avoid flames that had consumed flashier organizations in other cities. A visitor in those years might have noticed the way time moved in his presence. Conversations slowed. Breaths quieted. He once told a young earner that the difference between a smart man and a reckless one was a minute of silence before a decision. That minute became part of the office culture. Men walked out of the room less angry than they had entered, and bills got paid not because anyone shouted, but because everyone understood exactly where they stood. Providence wrapped around him like a familiar coat. He walked short blocks under streetlights that had seen a generation age. Neighbors nodded. Children on bikes cut across corners. To someone who didn't know, he could pass for a retired shop owner. To those inside the network, that cardigan and quiet gait signaled the opposite. The center of a regional order that had survived investigations, jail time, treacherous witnesses, and the slow pressure of changing laws. He had kept it intact with patience and precision. The hardest part, he knew, was keeping it intact as he grew older, and the world pressed closer. Summer heat pressed down on Providence the year a robbery shook his world. He had rebuilt his routine after getting out, trimmed his circle, and returned to that small office with a stricter version of the same rules. Then word came that a group had stormed a private storage firm that functioned like a shadow bank for men in his orbit. Safety boxes were pried open, and valuables that didn't like bank ledgers vanished in a morning. The city buzzed. People who never spoke loudly now spoke in whispers. He handled shock the way he handled everything else, slowly, with questions. Who knew the hours? Who had keys? Who had been complaining about money lately? Who had been seen spending when spending made no sense? He didn't pound a table. He kept voices calm and asked for full accounting, because nothing stung him more than theft inside the house. The fallout carried a lesson about how power works in quiet circles. The facility had existed because secrecy suited everyone: bar owners, bookmakers, loan collectors, even crooked brokers who needed off-book storage. The raid mocked that whole system. He responded by tightening screws in places where outsiders could not see. Routes were reshuffled so that certain men no longer stopped at certain bars. Envelopes changed hands at different times. Meetings moved. Suspected leakers lost access and income. Some of the robbers wound up in court later through state cases. Others met ends that made headlines and then left them. He never spoke publicly about the heist. He let the message move through private channels. This kind of betrayal cost more than any quick score could cover. It was a turning point for Rhode Island because it showed the scale of money that passed through town without touching a teller window. Investigators paid attention to the shock waves, the sudden selling of a flashy car by a guy who shouldn't have owned one, a girlfriend with new jewelry, a bettor whose bad luck briefly turned good. The press had a field day with nicknames and tall numbers. The boss ignored the noise and returned to habit. He redrew lines so that his core earners were men who had something to lose, who lived modestly, who understood why routine saved them. At the same time, federal prosecutors began building cases under a new framework designed for enterprises, not just isolated crimes. Indictments could braid together gambling, extortion, loan practices, cargo theft, and long-running influence over unions. He saw that change coming, and he adapted. The front companies grew more detailed, with invoices that explained every stop and every repair. Properties flipped on paper in ways that looked ordinary. Cash got broken down into smaller packets and took a longer walk before returning to Federal Hill. The aim was always to separate the man at the desk from the street moments that prosecutors loved to place before a jury. Boston simmered within that bigger shift. For years, the North End had operated under his umbrella, with Gennaro Angiulo serving as his daily face in that city. The lines were clear. Boston took care of its books, card clubs, protection agreements, and collections, and Providence took a regular share while providing the final say on disputes. The Irish across-town men who had survived earlier feuds held their own action, and the arrangement worked as long as no one reached too far. Then the FBI secured lawful orders and, after patient preparation, planted microphones in the North End offices where Angiulo and his lieutenants met. It took craft and help from people who weren't friends of the North End, but eventually the tapes began. Those recordings captured talk about debts, the disciplining of wayward earners, and the background approvals that made serious moves possible. Years later, they became the backbone of federal trials that sent Boston's Italian leadership away for long stretches. He did not panic when those stories broke. He adjusted. He told people around him to assume that any room could listen. He shrank the list of men allowed to carry messages between him and Boston. He insisted on meetings that sounded like nothing, talks about machine maintenance or coffee orders that carried the real message in a pause or a glance. The goal was simplicity. If the Bureau wanted to record him, they would hear a man discussing schedules and deliveries. He wouldn't give them theater. The list of ways money arrived remained varied because variety kept the center strong. Bookmakers took wagers on sports and horses, keeping careful sheets. A runner with a stack of numbers, slips from factory workers, still made reliable deposits, even as state lotteries cut into that trade. Card games rotated through back rooms, prearranged so neighbors would not complain. Loans continued, structured to push a debtor toward paying on time without public scenes. Protection agreements covered more than fists. They covered inspectors who might otherwise show up with forms at exactly the wrong hour. On docks and job sites, preferred subcontractors stayed preferred because they paid for timetables that never slipped. When a truck got lost between a warehouse and a store, it wasn't lost. It was part of a negotiation. On paper, it looked like delay. In reality, it reminded a stubborn manager to join the program. He had built useful relationships, not grand corruption. A permit would get reviewed sooner. A call would be returned faster. A minor charge would be filed under a statute that carried less bite. He didn't buy entire departments. He bought patience and access, then traded them for dollars. When the Providence Journal ran a long series based on years of secret files about his life, the reporting laid bare surveillance, phone dumps, and the breadth of his quiet regime. He didn't hold a press conference to deny anything. He showed up at his office and counted what came in that day. Outrage was for people who didn't understand that attention itself was a liability. Health never stopped pressing him. The tan oxygen tank by the desk had the same quiet presence as the lamp. There were days when he didn't make it to afternoon. He cut longer meetings to 10 minutes and still managed to steer a region. Even frail, he commanded the room through precision. A man would start to ramble and stop himself, realizing that every extra word raised risk. He taught younger hands how to replace swagger with calm. Walk in, sit, report receipts, answer questions, and leave. No stories, no boasts, no extra details. One afternoon, he used a rare longer meeting to talk through history with a younger earner who had never known a time before his rule. He explained that the only reason they were all still sitting there was that people feared getting ahead of themselves. In other cities, men chased headlines, and headlines brought raids. Here, the order he kept permission before action, sharing rather than turf spats. Steady percentages had produced fewer funerals and larger envelopes. He didn't pretend benevolence. He said, plainly, that keeping violence rare wasn't kindness. It was strategy. When the worst step had to be taken, it was taken with planning, after careful thought, because chaos never helped the ledger. The bonded vault shock also deepened his view of loyalty. He stopped treating closeness as a guarantee. Longtime hands got reviewed like new hires. A man who had eaten at his table for 20 years found his roots reduced until he proved he could be trusted with cash again. These choices hurt friendships, and he didn't flinch. His job, as he saw it, was not to be loved. It was to keep the system upright. He maintained understanding with families in New York who had an interest in certain parts of New England commerce. He rarely traveled south, preferring to send word or to receive visitors privately. Interstate disputes who got to supply a certain nightclub, who had final say over a waterfront deal, ended with practical compromises. He avoided fights he couldn't win, and steered clear of fights no one could win without burning revenue on both sides. Outsiders sometimes mistook these compromises as weakness. Insiders recognized them as arithmetic. Federal cases in the early 1982 began naming him in broader terms, describing an enterprise whose members extorted, controlled gambling, influenced union leaders, and skimmed earnings from businesses that wanted the easiest possible week. He entered not guilty pleas and fought with the methods he trusted: delays, questions about surveillance, medical records that showed he was hardly a flight risk, and lawyers who knew the local courts well. The Boston cases moved faster because of the electric power of those tapes. In Providence, the state and federal matters crawled, and he used the crawl to run the day-to-day as if nothing had changed. He kept many of the city's social rituals intact. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, no business was done at the ceremony, and everyone knew it. If someone asked a favor at a wake, he gave a mild look that said it would be remembered as an error. He protected neutral ground because rules like that kept feuds from spilling into places where the whole neighborhood would suffer. He never pretended he was protecting the public. He was protecting the quiet he required to earn. Some of the most consequential cases touching his world during that period had their roots years earlier. The Boston murder prosecutions that leaned on Joseph Barboza's testimony were still unraveling in appellate courts, revealing hidden FBI informant deals that stained the trials. Even when a judge ruled that a man had been sent away on tainted evidence, the damage to the organization was already done. Captains had died. Families had scattered. The old chains of command had been cut and then rewoven. He answered by training replacements who didn't see prison as the end of a career, just as a pause if they kept their mouths shut. He rewarded families quietly when a man did his time without flipping. Rent got covered. A car note got paid. Children's school shoes were bought without receipts. It wasn't charity, it was the maintenance of silence. The interplay with Irish crews entered a new phase when younger figures rose in Boston. They were clever, harder to read, and more comfortable with law enforcement circles than earlier generations. He kept his boundary the same: division of space, division of tasks, sharing where necessary, and a low ceiling on drama. When a Boston intermediary hinted that his side now had friends inside a federal office, he did not take the bait. He simply reminded everyone in earshot that state power changes with elections, but arithmetic does not. Pay on time, or your customers will spend next week somewhere else. Aging never softened his stance on narcotics. He knew the money that trade delivered, and he knew the sentences it carried. He treated it as an existential threat to the quieter income streams. When a lieutenant tested the fence by touching a product he had banned, the consequences were administrative before they were anything else. Routes stripped, introductions canceled, meetings rescheduled to happen without him. If the message failed, harder measures followed. He didn't declare war on drugs like a politician at a podium. He managed exposure the way a bookkeeper manages risk. Through the early 1,980 seconds, he spent more time in hospitals than in earlier years. Nurses who had known him only as a quiet, polite older man were surprised by the steady stream of visitors who spoke in soft voices and left quickly. He allowed only a handful into private rooms and told the rest to pass information through family. He never complained about pain. He complained when someone used a full name within earshot of a stranger. Even on a gurney, he expected discipline. The day news broke that the FBI had walked out of the North End with boxes of tapes and files. He sat in his office without speaking for a long time. He could picture how a court would hear those words. He could also picture how a jury would react to a man like Angiulo talking about life and death as if scheduling a delivery. He made no pitying comments. He simply told his own captains to prepare for a world where Boston's tribute would be smaller and slower, and where rumors would tempt people to make rash moves to replace lost income. He cautioned patience and offered something few expected, a temporary reduction in what Providence demanded from Boston. It was not generosity. It was medicine designed to keep a limb from dying. Late that year, as winter approached, he spoke more often about succession. The old guard knew who would follow him. His son had grown up inside the rules. Some veterans in Boston bridled at the idea that anyone from Providence could tell them what to do, let alone a younger man. He heard their quiet grumbling through intermediaries and did what he always did. He counted the numbers, and the numbers said order required a single point of command recognized from Worcester to the waterfront. He framed the transition as continuity, not novelty. Whether everyone liked the idea mattered less than whether they accepted the envelope schedule and the permissions protocol. That was the only test that counted. He died in the summer of 1984, an old man by the standards of his trade, a product of immigration and hard neighborhoods who had turned caution into power. The last years had been harder heart attacks, hospital stays, and the knowledge that cases against his orbit were piling up in Boston. He left behind a machine that did not look like a machine. Vending firms with regular routes, real estate managed by quiet men, small offices where coffee went stale on hot plates, and a memory of rules that had kept a city calmer than it might otherwise have been, while crimes continued every day. His death did not end the enterprise. It only removed the center of gravity that had kept tempers down and schedules intact. The transition was immediate. His son stepped into a chair that looked the same but felt different. Federal agents who had chased the father set their sights on the son. Old grudges resurfaced, new alliances formed, and the Boston cases built on tapes began to reshape what was possible in New England. But that was the next chapter. For decades, the man in the cardigan had balanced violence, money, and fear with the steadiness of a clerk. He had ordered things others could not say aloud and kept them from becoming a spectacle. He had taxed thousands of quiet transactions, bets, loans, favors, siphoning off the city's breath one envelope at a time. In private, even those who despised him admitted the clarity of his method. He did not celebrate. He did not strut. He did not pretend he was anything but what he was, the steward of a region's underworld commerce. If a bar owner wanted to keep his windows unbroken, he paid. If a card game wanted to run without strangers barging in, it paid. If a contractor wanted a shipment to arrive on the day the contract promised, he paid. The crimes were constant, and the rarely sung damage they caused spread out like ripples, families in debt, union ranks manipulated, businesses bent to serve a hidden budget. He knew those ripples well. He saw them and kept going, because the system he built depended on momentum. He believed order was the highest value in his world. and he enforced it with a quiet that made the enforcing look like normal life. Years later, people would look back at Providence in those decades and argue about whether his way prevented worse mayhem or simply disguised it. The record shows this much. He built a disciplined enterprise that reached across New England. He profited from every corner it touched. He fought the state with paperwork and patience, and he left behind successors who could imitate his routine but not fully recreate the peculiar authority that came from his presence. The man in that small office taught a region to conduct business in lowered voices. The city never completely forgot how. The day after the funeral, Providence woke up like it always did. Sun on brick, steam from coffee, deliveries thumping against shop doors. Men on Federal Hill who had moved in his orbit for years pretended the routine felt the same. It did not. They felt the absence most in the pauses. He had taught them that a minute of silence could prevent a month of trouble. Without him, the quiet felt different, more anxious, as if the room itself had lost its balance. A son took the chair. Paperwork stayed on the same desk. Phones still rang. Envelopes still arrived. But everyone who glanced at the doorway knew the particular gravity that once held that office together had been buried the day before. It made people remember in detail how that gravity formed in the first place. His upbringing had carved out edges that never softened. Worcester gave way to Providence when he was young, and he learned where to stand and when to move. He grew up in a time when laws created markets. Prohibition turned a bottle into a payday, and he learned early that speed and silence could become currency. He did small jobs first, looked older men in the eye, and accepted tasks that proved steadiness mattered more than swagger. Arrests came with that apprenticeship. Robbery, bootlegging, a fight that crossed a line, a job that went wrong and landed him in a cell. Those nights taught in him two lessons he never unlearned. First, that the law paid close attention when tempers ran hot. Second, that a man who remembered everything could use that memory to build a future that didn't depend on luck. He chose fronts that looked like chores. Cigarette machines and jukeboxes didn't thrill anyone on a sidewalk, but they placed him legally inside bars, diners, garages, clubhouses, and union halls across the region. With every machine came a reason to visit and a relationship to manage. He kept routes running, counted coins, wrote down what went where, and made sure he always had a second reason for a stop. The legitimate side paid bills and carried paperwork. The hidden side produced the money that mattered. Gambling lines, policy slips, card games, loans with terms that trapped a debtor in slow-moving chains, collection work that made default feel like a rare accident, freight that disappeared and reappeared at prices that matched the tune he set, union pressure that delivered or delayed entire projects. None of it looked dramatic from the curb, and he wanted it that way. When older Boston leadership drifted away, he took responsibility for an entire region. The shift wasn't announced. It happened because envelopes started running through Providence before they went anywhere else. A description that later hardened into fact captures the change. New England had a single referee now, and he sat on Atwell's Avenue. Crews in Worcester and Springfield, bookmakers around Boston, small-town numbers writers, Shylock operations from Hartford North, labor fixers around the docks and on road jobs. If a move affected more than one corner, they checked with him first. He didn't shout. He didn't dress it up. He ran the network the way he ran his office, on schedules and rules. The office itself told a story. A vending firm on paper, a second room in back, a desk that accepted news and sent out decisions. He liked clear lines. On any given weekday, a small parade filed through with updates and requests. A bookmaker reporting a handle. A route man offering counts and complaints about a stubborn bar owner. A fixer explaining that a permit might take 2 days longer unless someone somewhere remembered a favor. He listened, asked short questions, made a choice, wrote nothing he didn't have to, and sent people on their way. If a decision involved violence, he took his time. If violence followed his nod, it happened because he believed the alternative would threaten the machine. His world depended on money streams that never slept. Illegal gambling delivered daily cash because sports never paused, and horse races ran on tracks that felt as inevitable as the calendar. Numbers games drew tiny bets from factory workers and clerks, dollar by dollar adding up to an amount that mattered to anyone who controlled them. Card nights rotated, collected door money and rakes, and stayed just quiet enough to avoid sirens. Loans moved like waves. Borrowers paid a rate that punished delay and rewarded promptness. And collectors used tone rather than spectacle to keep people on schedule. Jobs on docks and in construction brought a different income. If a company wanted deliveries to land without mishaps, if a developer wanted inspectors to arrive on time and to focus on real safety instead of imagined issues, certain names on a list made everything easier. Those names owed allegiance to the desk on Atwell's. He also paid attention to politics, not with giant gestures but with small, precise pressure. He did not try to own an office. He tried to borrow time when he needed it. A delay here, a rescheduled visit there, a phone call returned that otherwise would be ignored. City halls always have people who like to solve problems for friends. He made it profitable to be counted as a friend. He understood ward maps and who controlled which committee. He didn't waste favors on vanity. He spent them to keep the bigger machine quiet. He drew a hard line against narcotics around his roots. He regarded that traffic as a magnet for attention he could not afford. He told his people why. Gambling and loans led to fines and manageable cases. Narcotics brought federal storms, unpredictable witnesses, and ruinous sentences. Some ignored him. When they did, he severed ties, reduced their world to nothing, and told everyone watching that breaking this rule carried a cost. He framed it as math, not morality. The effect was the same. He set terms for violence that made sense in a ledger. It happened only when he believed it would prevent costlier chaos. Those decisions moved through a process as controlled as anything else he managed. Sit-downs came first. Warnings followed. Fines could be imposed. Removal from a route or a territory hurt. Only after those steps failed did the darkest option move onto the board. He wanted nothing public and refused to give the press what it craved. That didn't mean his world was gentle. It meant harm arrived without scenes, as often as he could arrange it. The cases that scarred his later years grew out of that tension between quiet method and violent consequence. Rhode Island investigators, convinced he approved killings while keeping his hands clean, planted microphones in his office without proper authorization, and harvested hours of talk that included permission and planning in tones so bland that a stranger would have missed their meaning. Those recordings fed a case after two Providence figures, Rudy Marfeo and Anthony Millay, were slain in 1968. Prosecutors told a jury that the nod that mattered came from his chair. The conviction for conspiracy to commit murder signaled that prosecutors had found a way to punish a man who rarely left his desk. Years later, judges concluded the way those conversations were captured violated constitutional protections and threw out the key evidence. He walked out older and ill, carrying a lesson he pushed onto every visitor afterward. Assume every wall can hear, and if you must speak, say less than you think. Barbosa's turn as a government witness energized another set of prosecutions that reached into the highest ranks of his wider orbit. The Deegan murder in Chelsea became a showcase for a strategy that would define an era, flip a violent insider, build cases with his testimony, and paint a picture of a pyramid that allowed prosecutors to charge people who hadn't pulled a trigger. Some of those verdicts held for decades until courts concluded that agents had hidden evidence that would have changed jurors' minds. The damage, though, had already been done. Lives spent behind bars, crews dismantled, territory reshaped. He saw clearly that informants, more than surveillance, could tear apart what he had spent years constructing. Surveillance caught up anyway. When the FBI lawfully wired the Boston headquarters run by his representative Gennaro Angiulo, they captured the phone calls and room chat that prosecutors dream about, details of gambling lines, enforcement talk against wayward earners, musings about who deserved to keep which piece of the city. Those tapes made jurors believe what agents had long suspected, and the trials they propelled took down Boston's Italian leadership. The Providence office adjusted by making meetings even slower and duller. He reduced his voice to nods and pauses and expected intermediaries to carry messages that sounded like nothing. The adjustment saved him from what would have been his own voice, replayed in front of strangers. He also dealt in theft that looked like misplacement rather than force. Trucks drifted off route. Pallets failed to arrive. Insurance paid out amounts negotiated quietly in back rooms. Merchandise surfaced in stores that had never seen the original invoice. Hijacking in that context looked less like a glove over a mouth and more like a spreadsheet gone slightly off track. The companies affected often decided to join the program rather than fight it. They preferred predictability to principle when shipments mattered more than speeches. The famous robbery of a private storage facility for men in his world, countless boxes torn open, jewelry and cash gone in a day, tested his system. Word spread across Rhode Island like a rumor with a megaphone. He answered by trimming every branch of his tree. Suspects lost routes without a public accusation. Collections happened in different places, at different times. Partnerships shuffled. He recognized that greed inside the circle could do what police had failed to do: break trust. He rebuilt that trust with discipline instead of fiery punishment, knowing that revenge staged for effect would only feed headlines. The press feasted on leaked files and long investigations. A newspaper series arranged documents and wire summaries into a portrait of years of careful management of crime. Readers saw how often his name appeared. He did not perform outrage or sue for libel. He went to work. He believed that the best answer to attention was repetition of the routine that had outlived every storm so far. He understood better than anyone that the system relied on two illusions: that customers thought they were choosing freely, and that neighbors thought nothing unusual was happening. The crimes he oversaw left marks everywhere, even when they didn't make a sound. Families lost savings to bad bets, and then lost months of peace to collection schedules they couldn't meet. Bar owners lived in a compromise they hated, staying open by paying, pretending they weren't paying, then paying again to stay open. Workers on docks and job sites watched assignments move like favors rather than like fair wages. Honest contractors learned that delays could be manufactured and solved, each side of the delay costing money. Even the polite parts of his world, thank you turkeys at holidays, a quiet donation after a hospital stay, didn't cancel the damage. They softened it just enough to keep people in line. He trained people to accept his way as the normal order of things. The training began with language. He disliked names, discouraged stories, cut short any sentence that explained too much. He taught location discipline. No talk near doors, no talk on the street, no talk in cars that didn't belong to you, careful talk on phones if any. He taught timing. Arrive on schedule, leave quickly, understand that lingering was a risk. He taught money etiquette. Cash folded twice, not once. Numbers rounded so you didn't need to write them. Counts announced in a rhythm that let a listener hear pressure without a single threat. He took pride in the craft, even if he never used that word. In his final years, he turned the same craft on succession. He didn't script speeches. He created conditions. He placed his son in meetings, then in rooms without him, then in decisions that could be traced back to Providence without tracing back to him. He reduced attendance lists so that when the time came, every person who mattered had already adjusted to the new gravity. It didn't make transitions painless. It made them survivable. The government's larger project outlasted him. New laws and old patience converged to expose his Boston representatives and to pressure the roots that fed Providence. The legal consequences that landed after he died still grew from choices made while he held the chair: how gambling lines were set, how loans were structured, how crews were rotated, how permissions were granted, how union influence was deployed. Prosecutors used those choices to show a pattern in courtrooms, and jurors believed it because the pattern matched what they felt in their neighborhoods. They understood that something had been happening in plain sight, in coffee shops and back rooms, and along harbors, for years. If you walked past his old office after he was gone, nothing seemed grand. A few men in work jackets, a truck backing up, a door held open for someone older. That was always the disguise and the truth. He didn't run a kingdom, he ran a schedule. The schedule collected the city's loose change, the bets, the small fees, the quiet favors, and stacked it until the pile towered over everyone who had ever tried to face him down alone. He followed habits that gave him the power to reach into houses that never once opened his door, and to steer decisions made in buildings where he never raised his voice. The record of that reach lives in court files, and in the memory of families who paid, sometimes for years, for a phone call they shouldn't have made, a debt they couldn't outrun, a favor that came back with a bill. This is the story of a man who orchestrated crimes with the calm of a clerk and the patience of a bookkeeper, who taught a region to treat fear like routine, who broke laws every day without needing a spotlight or a speech. He didn't leave behind monuments, only habits. People who learned those habits spread them long after his chair emptied. They kept the money moving, they kept the talk quiet. and they told themselves that order counted for more than anything else. In his world, it did until laws, tapes, and age showed that even the quietest structure can crack. After the summer he left the scene for good, the people who had watched him work began to fill in the spaces he never explained. They told stories not for romance, but to make sense of how one small office ended up steering so much of New England's shadow economy. They remembered the odd mix of humility and control. A cardigan instead of a suit of armor, a ledger instead of a flourish, an oxygen tank hissing softly while he decided whether a fight would end with a handshake or a headline. The more they talked, the clearer the pattern looked. He had treated every corner of his world like a route planned, predictable, checked twice, set to run even if the driver didn't show up one morning. Long before the desk on Atwell's Avenue became a destination, he came up hard. Worcester childhood, immigrant parents, jobs that started before dawn. Then Providence, where Federal Hill's tight blocks taught a teenager how to keep his eyes open and his voice down. He learned how laws could turn demand into opportunity. When Prohibition made liquor the hottest commodity, he didn't try to be the star of a show. He carried messages and drove cars that ended up in alleys behind bars that never advertised their best stock. Arrests came during those early years: robbery cases, bootlegging tangles, scraps that ended badly. He did time, learned faces, and stepped back onto the street a little more careful every round. By the 1,940 seconds, he had chosen fronts that fit his temperament. Cigarette machines and jukeboxes were dull to anyone who didn't see what they offered. Each placement meant a relationship with a bar owner, a diner manager, a union hall clerk. He stacked those relationships until they became a map, and beyond the machines he layered the revenue that mattered. Sports and horse betting handled by bookmakers he could trust, policy slips collected from factory workers and cleaners who liked small wagers, card games that rotated through back rooms where the house kept a steady slice, short-term loans at painful rates that turned late payments into leverage, hijacked freight that vanished off highways and reappeared in friendly stores, and pressure on docks and construction sites that made schedules behave so long as contractors made room for the names he supplied. To understand his idea of order, look at how he moved the center of gravity. For decades, Boston's North End had been the gathering point. When a previous leader slipped away to Italy under heat, he made Providence the hub without blowing trumpets. Nothing grand happened on a single day. Instead, envelopes began to pass through his hands first. A nod from Boston became a nod checked against Providence. Worcester and Springfield learned the new path. Hartford and the mill towns to the north and west adjusted too. He wasn't loud about authority. He created routine, and routine did the rest. Inside that small office, he practiced a ritual. Men came in one by one. They reported numbers. They asked permission. They floated a fix for a problem at a union local or a nightclub. He asked a few questions, made a decision, and sent them back out the door. He wrote almost nothing down, not because he distrusted paper, but because he preferred memory. He had a way of turning a glare into a sentence. When someone bragged or explained too much, he stopped him with a look. When a collector proposed a heavy-handed stunt to scare a debtor, he cut him off with a single phrase: "Make it quiet." Violence lived inside the system as a last resort, a managerial tool rather than a thrill. If a decision meant someone would not go home, it had followed arguments, fines, reassignment, and warnings. He removed heat with delays and small punishments because heat burned money. His rule against narcotics near his roots made practical sense. He spelled it out to anyone who asked. Gambling and loans drew predictable charges. Narcotics drew time that stacked up, a tension that never left, and witnesses who seemed to sprout in clusters. He understood the size of drug profits, and even so, refused to trade one strong line of income for a fire that might consume all of them. When men on the edges ignored him, he cut them off fast. If they kept pushing, they learned that distance from Providence meant distance from good lawyers, helpful city workers, and union leaders who answered calls. He managed risk by starving it rather than wrestling it in public. The list of people around him over the decades shows his appetite for steady hands. In Boston, Gennaro Angiulo became the daily face of his authority, running bookmaking, card rooms, and collections, and settling disputes in the North End. He worked with older figures like Henry Tamaleo, a high-ranking player whose name later showed up in the Deegan case, and who died behind bars, insisting he had been framed, as well as more volatile earner enforcers who needed constant supervision. He also had to navigate Irish crews. Winter Hill on one side of town, Charlestown on the other. He didn't try to erase them. He settled practical boundaries, cut percentages, and punished anyone who turned a negotiation into a street scene. Over time, rivals accepted an arrangement that paid them reliably in exchange for calm, because calm let everyone eat. The 1957 Appalachian fiasco, when a rural patrolman stumbled onto a meeting of dozens of mob figures at a New York estate, exploded public denial about national coordination. He hadn't needed that reminder of scale. He already had quiet recognition from leaders in other cities. But the word conspiracy began to travel faster after that day, and he adapted by shrinking his circle and keeping his movements local. His office, fronted by National Cigarette Service and Coin-O-Matic, became both headquarters and bunker. Then came the recording age. Rhode Island investigators, certain he approved killings while hiding behind clerical routines, broke into his world without legal authority and hid microphones in his office. The devices picked up conversations about gambling lines, extortion demands, and, most damaging to him, consent for violent solutions to recurring problems. When two Providence figures tied to gambling, Rudy Marfeo and his friend Anthony Melee, were shot dead in 1968, prosecutors rolled into court with witnesses and snippets of those recordings. A jury convicted him of conspiracy to commit murder. He left the office for a cell, older, fragile of heart, and yet still in command by proxy. Years later, Rhode Island's highest court ruled that the way the state had captured those conversations violated constitutional protections and threw out critical evidence. He came home thinner, angrier, and even more disciplined. From then on, if he could communicate with a nod, he would never use a word. That lesson arrived alongside another earthquake from Boston. Joseph Barboza, a feared Boston enforcer, became a government witness. He told jurors that orders had flowed through the hierarchy he served, naming high-ranking men in the murder of Edward Teddy Deegan in Chelsea. Convictions followed. Decades later, judges concluded that federal agents had hidden key facts and protected other informants by steering blame toward the wrong men, including Peter Limone and Louis Greco, who lost large pieces of their lives to a case that should have been tried differently. Those reversals didn't absolve the enterprise of violence. They exposed how the government's own hunger for wins could warp the record. He watched it all like a man counting the cost of oxygen. He needed to breathe, he needed to keep business running, and he needed to remember that informants, once flipped, could rearrange a map faster than any rival crew. The bonded vault heist in 1975 drove home a different danger and betrayal from inside. A group of men raided a private storage facility in Johnston, used by underworld figures as a quiet bank. Hundreds of safe boxes got pried open in a morning, and valuables vanished. The number floated higher each time it was retold, but even the calmest estimate made stomachs turn. He responded not with public revenge, but with structural fixes. Routes reassigned, meetings moved, permissions revoked, suspected leakers reduced to nothing. Some culprits went on trial. Others suffered outcomes no one described in print. The heist's moral was clear to him. The network survived because men trusted that the center protected their assets. When that trust cracked, only stricter order could patch it. His reach into labor and logistics kept paying. If a builder wanted to avoid a week of a job site idling over a misunderstanding, hiring lists had to include specific names. If a shipping firm needed a strike to stop by Friday, someone made a call to a union hall, and the storm died down in exchange for cooperation down the line. These weren't cinematic stick-ups. They were schedule control for profit. The benefit for his side came in envelopes. The benefit for firms on the other end came in predictability. He made opponents out of stubborn men who thought they could outrun the calendar without help. Most gave up after one bad month. He avoided obvious corruption. He didn't buy whole departments. He found the clerk who could move a permit to the top of a stack, the inspector who would show up tomorrow instead of today, the courthouse employee who could whisper which judge would hear a case. When he spent favors, it was to buy time. Time to move a meeting out of a room that might be wired. Time to calm a hothead who wanted to make a point with a stunt that would hurt the bottom line. Time to let the press chase a different story. In the late 1000s, 970 seconds, and early 1980 seconds. Federal prosecutors began using racketeering laws to charge patterns instead of single acts. The Boston office drew the most heat. After careful legal groundwork and help from inside, agents placed microphones in the North End headquarters where Angiulo and his lieutenants talked. Those recordings captured casual talk about enforcement decisions, gambling profits, and the division of neighborhoods. Juries didn't need imagination. They heard the business plain. Convictions followed, and Boston's Italian leadership went away for long sentences. He, already ill, watched another storm approach and made the only move he could: shrink everything again. Fewer in-person visits, more pauses, even shorter sentences spoken into phones. When Boston's flow slowed because key men were gone, he cut Providence's tax for a period to prevent desperate moves that would blow up the whole map. His life never fit the movie version. He lived modestly, kept the same office, walked the same blocks, and preferred a coffee shop stool to a corner booth in a flashy restaurant. He treated baptisms, weddings, and funerals as neutral ground. If someone tried to sneak business into a wake, he remembered and punished the breach later. These customs weren't sentiment. They were tools to keep conflicts away from places where outrage could grow. In a small city, a few shared rules can keep neighbors from becoming enemies overnight. The harm caused by his system never disappeared just because it rarely made the front page. Gamblers sank their paychecks and then paid again in interest. Bar owners who wanted to stand alone eventually learned that standing alone meant broken windows, slow deliveries, and surprise inspections. Workers found schedules assigned like favors. Honest contractors wondered how the bid they won on paper had somehow turned into a job they could only finish on someone else's terms. He profited from each turn of that screw, and he didn't apologize. He thought of it as management. The police and the press kept score in their own ways. Certain Providence Journal reporters dug through old files and built series that revealed a life of daily crimes managed with his brand of cool. They printed the names of companies that gave him cover, the circles of influence, the quiet overlaps between business and fear. He did not issue statements. He made the day's phone calls and kept moving. He believed that routine, done well, could outlast fury. As his health failed heart attacks, long hospital stays, he prepared a succession that looked less like a coronation and more like a continuation. He sat his son in the chair, then let him run meetings without him, then let him decide small disputes, then bigger ones. He reduced attendance lists until only the men his son trusted were present. He knew the risks. Younger men in Boston saw Providence's authority as memory rather than law. He met that with arithmetic. Envelopes still passed through one place, and permissions still mattered if people wanted to earn without hearing sirens. He died in 1984, leaving behind an organization that didn't look like an organization at all, just vending firms, service trucks, property holdings, and a rhythm that made crime feel like part of the city. The cases that followed, built on the Boston tapes and on flipped witnesses, reshaped the New England landscape. But much of what the government proved in the years after his death described habits he had set in motion. Centralized permission, strict limits on violence, revenue from gambling, loans, union leverage, and quiet influence. Even the famous FBI recording of a Patriarca family induction ceremony in the late 1980 seconds a moment that showed jurors how the group formalized ranks belonged to the era after him, run by men who grew up under his rules and thought they could reproduce his order without his caution. Looking back, the list of crimes tied to his seasons in charge is long and specific. Supervision of illegal gambling across multiple cities. Loans at rates designed to trap. Extortion of businesses under the cover of protection. Theft and resale of freight, skimming from construction and municipal contracts. Manipulation of union hiring and schedules. Bribery and favors traded for access and delay. Approval of violent acts, including killings, when he believed they were necessary to protect income streams, and, in the years when technology and informants outpaced his caution, conspiracy convictions that stuck until courts struck down the way evidence had been gathered. He didn't maim with his own hands. He made choices that put harm in motion and then treated the fallout as a cost of doing business. He thought of himself as a manager of a complicated enterprise. He chose clerical habits, morning hours, a ledger's calm, consistent rules, not because he liked paperwork, but because routine disguised the gravity of his choices. He preferred problems solved before the public saw them. He trained men to accept that the only applause anyone needed was the quiet click of a door closing on another normal day. That discipline made him powerful. It also made it harder for outsiders to see how much damage a calm man could do with a nod. After he was gone, Providence felt both lighter and less steady. The air lost the particular weight he carried into a room, and the system he had built had to prove it could stand without him. Men in Boston, Worcester, Hartford, and the mill towns still made calls south. Envelopes still landed. But the quiet that had been his signature got harder to maintain. Without his minute of silence at the right time, younger men filled the space with words they couldn't take back. Investigators, already patient, needed only to wait for the routines to falter. When they did, recordings and witnesses completed the story. He had created a playbook for a region. Keep violence rare, keep money steady, keep attention away. He understood exactly what he was doing, and he did it long enough to convince a city that it was normal. The record that survives court decisions tossing illegal recordings, appeals arguing over witnesses who lied, trial transcripts of Boston bosses caught on tape, news reports counting the take from card games and docks, tells a simple truth about him. He believed order would protect him. Order protected him for a long time. Then time, law, and breath caught up, and the order he left behind had to live on its own. In the years after he was gone, people tried to pin down what, exactly, he had built. Detectives who had logged hours outside his door revisited notebooks. Prosecutors read transcripts again to understand what the words meant in the mouths of men trained to say little. Bookmakers, bartenders, union hands, and contractors told younger co-workers how the city had felt under a steadier, colder kind of management. Families who had watched paychecks drip away into betting slips and interest payments explained how debt becomes a routine instead of a drama. The broad picture that emerged wasn't a myth. It was a system with rules strict enough to keep tempers down and profits up, a structure that turned caution into power. He learned order early. A childhood split between Worcester and Providence taught a boy how to keep his posture neutral and his ears open. Prohibition sharpened that perception. When laws created scarcity, small favors paid large. He drove, carried, waited, and learned where to stand. Arrests came with that schooling robbery, bootlegging, street fights that got out of hand. Each time he walked out, he was less interested in swagger and more interested in how money actually traveled through neighborhoods. He chose a cover that looked like chores, cigarette vending, and jukebox routes. Those metal boxes gave him reasons to visit storefronts from morning to night. Behind the friendly service call, a second conversation always lurked, about favors, debts, introductions, and the reach of a quiet promise. By the early 1950 seconds, he had turned Providence into a fulcrum. Older leadership in Boston thinned, and the North End, long the anchor for Italian crews, found itself checking with Federal Hill on decisions that touched multiple cities. Worcester bookies, Springfield card organizers, Hartford loanmen, and operators in mill towns felt the same pull. One desk on Atwell's Avenue became the place where permission lived. That office looked like a clerk's room, a ledger blotter, a phone, a lamp with a soft glow, a coffee cup, a clock that marked out the day. The disguise wasn't just appearance. He ran his world like a small business. Set hours, short meetings, narrow lanes of authority, clear penalties for anyone who put attention ahead of revenue. Income arrived in steady streams. Sports betting and horse racing brought daily cash that fed the whole. Numbers, wagers from factory workers and clerks, tiny bets stacked by the hundreds created reliable piles. Card nights rotated through rooms where the house took a consistent rake. Loans at punishing rates transformed bad weekends into patterns that were nearly impossible to escape. Protection agreements covered bars and clubs in ways that dressed coercion as peace of mind. Freight drifted off routes and returned as leverage. Influence over union hiring and job assignments turned schedules into tools that punished the stubborn and rewarded the cooperative. None of it looked dramatic to a passerby. That was the point. He kept it dull on the surface and brisk underneath. He knew that noise was expensive. He also understood that violence, uncontrolled, would bankrupt him faster than any detective could. He set a ladder of responses. Talk first, fine second, remove privileges third, and only then, if chaos threatened the whole, approve harsher steps. Approvals moved through old rituals. A sit-down, a single sentence, a nod. He did not pretend those choices were clean. He knew exactly what they were. He simply refused to let them become spectacles. He forbade people from using his name in angry moments, punished men who chased reputation instead of results, and treated every headline as a failure of management. The government, slow at first to see the scale of the structure, woke up after a rural patrolman's curiosity exposed a countryside meeting of national figures in 1957. Washington built new tools and better patience. In New England, the first major strike against his office came from microphones planted without lawful permission. Those early eavesdroppers broke in where judges hadn't allowed and hid devices that brought his bland approvals into court after two Providence figures tied to gambling disputes were found dead. Prosecutors presented the conspiracy case with snatches of his tone, soft and managerial, and a jury convicted him. He went to prison breathing hard, years of stress drawing lines on his face. On appeal, a court threw out the tainted recordings. He came home older, stricter, and nearly silent, convinced that words were a currency he could no longer spend. About the same time, across the Charles, Boston produced a witness whose testimony echoed for decades. A feared enforcer turned on his old allies and told jurors that orders for a Chelsea killing had come from high places. Convictions followed. Years later, judges concluded that federal agents had hidden crucial facts, sending men away who should not have been convicted on that record. The reversals revealed two truths at once. The enterprise he ran did approve deadly acts, and the government's appetite for a win sometimes created its own injustices. Those tangled truths haunt every attempt to explain that era. He adapted as the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds arrived. New racketeering statutes allowed prosecutors to charge patterns instead of single events. He countered by shrinking his circles and pushing decisions downward through men who spoke in half sentences. Real meetings moved to places where mechanical ears failed. Busy diners, crowded markets, walks under traffic noise. He never stopped using the vending company office, but he turned it into a stage where only the most harmless exchanges played out. Names vanished from conversations. Nods replaced words. If someone tried to explain more than necessary, he cut them off with a look. Boston's Italian leadership, still powerful but too loud for their own good, became a case study. After careful legal groundwork, agents placed microphones in the North End offices where daily business happened. Those tapes captured the rhythm of gambling, extortion, and discipline without polite disguises, and jurors heard the unvarnished version of a world that had stayed just out of reach for years. Convictions followed. His answer was as simple as always. Shrink further, demand dullness, lessen taxes on Boston temporarily to prevent rash moves, and keep Providence steady while the North adjusted to missing captains. A spectacular robbery in Rhode Island tested his system from a different angle. A group hit a private storage firm used by men in his orbit as an underground bank. Safe boxes were opened, and valuables moved out in hours. The size of the take turned heads statewide. He responded with a structural fix, not a speech. Routes reassigned, permissions revoked, meetings relocated, and anyone suspected of loose talk saw their world shrink. Cases later put some robbers behind bars. Others ran out of luck quietly. The deeper lesson for him was clearer than any number in the papers. Betrayal rots a network faster than law enforcement does, so rebuild trust by tightening procedures, not by staging revenge. The record of his direct offenses is long and specific. He supervised widespread illegal gambling that spanned city neighborhoods and mill towns. He profited from loans structured to keep borrowers on a painful schedule. He extorted businesses under the euphemism of protection. He oversaw theft and resale of freight when opportunity made it easy. He used union influence to steer jobs, manipulate hiring lists, and turn schedules into tools. He traded favors and small bribes to secure inspections, delays, or quiet phone calls returned. He approved violent acts, including killings, when he judged that only those would keep the machine from shaking apart. He did all of it while seated behind a desk, in a sweater rather than a suit, using clerical habits to mask the damage. He taught men to treat narcotics as poison to the enterprise, not out of morality but calculation. Drug money drew storms he could not control, long sentences, federal attention that wouldn't lift, informants who multiplied, and undercover work that ripped structures open. He barred that traffic near his routes, punished anyone who flirted with it, and made examples administratively before anything darker happened. The rule didn't eliminate risk, but it kept some heat off the sections that mattered most to him. His methods influenced what came next, for better and worse. After his death, the family that bore his name tried to continue the routine. A son took the chair. A tough underboss from Connecticut kept order until he was murdered. A signal that the balance he had held together with calm and arithmetic was splintering. Boston, under heavy pressure from years of tapes and trials, produced both vacancies and ambition. Younger figures rose, some clever enough to play at civility, others primed for stunts that drew headlines. In 1989, agents captured audio of a formal induction ceremony for his old organization, the first full recording of that ritual that Americans ever heard. Voices on that tape described the obligations that came with membership. The sound, played in courtrooms in the early 1990 seconds, did what no amount of theory had done. It made a secret process sound ordinary and real. That recording belonged to a chapter after him, but the structure described on it was the one he had shaped. Even as successors tried to imitate the old style, the environment had changed. Jurors had learned the language. Financial analysts could follow cash through property records and shell companies. Undercover work had grown subtle. Court rulings had refined what evidence was acceptable and what was not, forcing investigators to build cases more carefully and making them harder to shake on appeal. The old man's answer had always been the same: reduce words, shorten meetings, spread decision-making, but even that minimalist approach struggled against a world where cameras and microphones shrank and where betrayal paid better than silence. Meanwhile, Providence remembered. Some residents still tell their children that the neighborhood felt safer then because certain lines weren't crossed. The fuller truth, repeated in courtrooms and kitchens, is harder. Calm existed because fear did the work. Bar owners who paid were left alone while their competitors learned how quickly a broken window or a delayed shipment could change a week. Workers took assignments that fit someone else's plan. Gamblers watched their habits turned into leverage. None of that qualifies as safety. It is simply the reliability of coercion. Law schools and police academies teach his era now. Cases that bear his name or revolve around his office serve as examples for how to treat illegal surveillance, how to handle informants, and how to assemble a racketeering indictment that persuades jurors without tipping into overreach. The Rhode Island decision tossing the unlawful recordings from his office remains a caution about how compelling evidence loses its power when obtained the wrong way. The Boston tapes stand as a counterexample. Years of lawful work capturing a criminal hierarchy in its own voice. He remains a study in style as much as substance. Where others glorified, he minimized. Where others chased status, he chased quiet. Those preferences made him effective and dangerous. He taught a region that crime can look like routine. You could miss it if you only looked for raised fists and getaways. You had to listen for the way a room settled when he stared at a phone. You had to watch the way a collector smoothed a bill before sliding it across a table. You had to notice who got a permit reviewed quickly and who never saw their application leave the stack. That is how power lived inside small offices and on short blocks for decades. People who worked against him admit a grudging respect for his patience. Respect doesn't mean approval. The harm he authorized still lives in records and in families' memories, but they remember how rare his type has become. Modern figures tend to talk too much, chase too many side hustles, and treat public feuds like entertainment. He did none of that. He ran a regional criminal economy like a schedule. He managed violence like a last resort policy. He kept lawyers and doctors busy and journalists frustrated. That's why his name still gets spoken softly in Providence coffee shops, when old-timers tell young ones how the city once felt. Walk past Atwell's today, and it looks like any lively street restaurants, chatter, families on an evening stroll. That surface existed then too. Beneath it, during his decades at the desk, money moved through quiet agreements and familiar envelopes. The lessons of that time are not comfortable. Communities can adapt to almost anything if it arrives slowly and politely. Fear can be mistaken for order if it arrives in the voice of a grandfather. And a man can make decisions that destroy lives while never raising his tone above the hum of a vending office. That is what he did. That is why investigators never stopped circling the block. That is why jurors in later years nodded when they heard the tapes from Boston. They recognized the sound of a system that New England had been living with for a very long time. He is gone, but the trail is long. Appeals, transcripts, business records, property deeds, and the oral histories of working people still add new details to the map. The broad lines, though, are set. An immigrant's son learned to read a neighborhood. He built a structure that gathered illegal income from gambling, loans, freight, unions, and protection. He enforced rules that kept violence controlled and attention low. He used patience as a weapon. He survived prosecutions, lost a major case, and then won it back when a court enforced the Constitution, and adapted until his heart finally gave out. The machine kept turning for a while. Then newer pressures, stronger laws, and human nature turned that steady hum into a stutter. What remains is the memory of how quiet can disguise harm, and how a ledger, a phone, and a whisper can hold a city by the collar for a very long time. Winter settles on Federal Hill with the kind of quiet he liked. Snow softens curbs and rooftops, and the neighborhood looks like a postcard if you ignore the history inside those brick walls. People who lived through his era still point at doorways where deals were made, and at windows where curtains shifted when new cars stopped out front. They remember a man who never chased a camera, and a room where the clock ticked louder than any voice. They remember the way a meeting could end with a nod that meant yes, or a silence that meant no, and how that difference shaped lives for years. Time has moved on. The office is a different place now, but the structure he designed, rules, routines, boundaries, still explains how New England's underworld operated for decades, and why the city felt a certain way while he sat in that chair. Start with the skills that turned a small life into a large reach. He grew up in crowded houses, where money didn't stretch far, and where children absorbed adult tensions without being told what they were. In Worcester first and then Providence, he found that listening traveled further than swagger. When Prohibition gave teenagers work that adults called foolish until rent came due, he learned to drive, to wait, to pass a note without being noticed. Arrests taught him caution. Stints behind bars taught him how institutions function and which doors creak. He came back from each scrape with less appetite for risk that couldn't be counted, and more respect for steady processes. That is how an unremarkable storefront on Atwell's Avenue became a control room for gambling lines, loans, protection schemes, a steady trade in stolen goods, and influence that reached into docks, job sites, and offices where small decisions mattered. He built his cover on machines that needed refilling. Cigarette vending and jukebox routes put coin boxes and service calls in bars and diners all over the region. Those routes gave him reasons to visit. Behind the routine service talk, other conversations happened. A bar owner mentioned an inspector who suddenly started visiting. A contractor hinted that a shipment had arrived late twice in a month. A union rep whispered about a challenge at the hall. He turned that trickle of information into leverage. On the legitimate side, he counted coin, scheduled refills, paid drivers, balanced books. On the hidden side, he coordinated bookmaking from Boston's North End to old mill towns, oversaw card nights where the house always took a share, set terms for loans that rewarded promptness and punished delay, arranged protection that dressed coercion as insurance, used shortages and slowdowns to remind stubborn managers that participation had benefits, and steered union calendars to keep friends paid and skeptics patient. The money came in quietly, daily, without spectacle. That was the point. As older leadership in Boston faded, he made Providence the hub. He didn't stage a takeover. He converted habits. Boston still mattered, but its crews checked with Federal Hill on moves that would touch more than one block. Worcester, Springfield, Hartford, Lawrence, and the smaller places in between learned the same reflex. That transition worked because his office offered predictability in a line of work that devours it. Anyone who cooperated could expect an envelope schedule, an answer when tempers boiled, a referee when two men claimed the same route. Ignoring the office meant mystery delays, unfriendly visits, and, if someone insisted on defiance, losing a livelihood or worse. He preferred the first outcome. He hated chaos because chaos costs money. The harm he enabled operated at a human scale. Gamblers lost paychecks and then borrowed to cover the loss. Those loans carried rates that wrapped themselves around a life and squeezed. Bar owners who tried to stand alone discovered that coincidences pile up when you don't cooperate: late deliveries, sudden code issues, vandalism that nobody saw. On job sites, crews learned that assignments didn't always follow seniority or skill. They followed arrangements made far from the site. Honest firms found themselves priced out of fair work by managers who preferred a quick fix to a fair fight. He lived on these pressures. He called them business. A neighborhood would call them something else, but only in kitchens, not to a reporter. He set a ladder for enforcement. First conversations, then penalties that cut income, then removal from routes. Only if those steps failed, and only if the broader balance felt threatened, did he approve anything final. Those approvals ran through a restrained ritual, a sit-down, a short sentence, a pause that meant the decision had landed. He refused to turn any of it into spectacle. He punished people who brought attention. He scolded men who chased reputation. He thought of violence as a management choice, not a performance. And he treated headlines as a sign that someone had failed his lesson. Law enforcement, after years of skepticism about how organized the networks really were, began to match his patience. The countryside raid at Appalachian in 1957 embarrassed federal leadership into acknowledging the obvious. In Rhode Island, investigators grew convinced that the office behind the vending company was the place where permissions were granted and disputes resolved. They moved too fast on the methods, breaking into spaces without proper warrants and planting microphones that captured the calm tone of his approvals. After 2 Providence figures tied to gambling disputes were killed, those recordings improperly obtained helped deliver a conspiracy conviction. He went to prison, older and ill. Appeals later threw out the core of the state's evidence as unconstitutional. He returned home thinner, even quieter, and allergic to wasted words. The rule he repeated afterward could have been etched above the door. Assume the walls listen. And if you must speak, say less than you think. Across the line in Boston, another tactic took hold. Flip a violent insider and build cases up the hierarchy with his testimony. Joseph Barboza did that work with zeal. He described a Chelsea killing in a way that placed orders in the mouths of high-ranking men and sent some of them away for decades. Years later, judges concluded that federal agents had hidden key facts and steered blame to protect other sources. Some convictions were vacated. The truth was messy but instructive. The organization sanctioned deadly acts, but the government sometimes bent its own rules to land a case. He learned from both halves. The risk from betrayal outweighed the risk from microphones, and both could be survived with procedure if he respected their power. The bonded vault robbery in 1975 delivered a different shock. A betrayal engineered by people close enough to know where valuables slept. A private storage business used as a de facto bank for men in his world was hit in a morning. The size of the loss made even quiet men angry. He answered with systems, not theatrics. Routes rearranged, permissions revoked, meetings moved. The circle tightened until trust regrew under pressure. Courtrooms handled some culprits. Street gravity and bad luck handled others. He took the larger lesson from the aftermath. When insiders decide to act like outsiders, only stricter routines save the interior. Meanwhile, the federal playbook improved. Racketeering statutes let prosecutors combine gambling, loans, extortion, labor manipulation, and obstruction into one story. He countered with dullness. Fewer names spoken, fewer gatherings in rooms built for echoes, more walks, more meetings in places with clatter. He shifted visible business further into legitimate fronts. Service companies, properties, coin routes, and treated paperwork like camouflage. He still called shots, but he taught those around him to make half a sentence do the work of a paragraph. Boston's Italian branch, stacked with reputation and confidence, talked too freely for too long. After judges signed warrants and informants helped with logistics, agents captured the daily rhythm inside North End offices. Jurors heard how gambling sheets traveled, how debts were enforced, how disputes settled. Those trials sent leaders away. He adjusted the only way he could. Temporary tax cuts to keep Boston affiliates steady, stricter filters on who could get a message to him, insistence that Providence remain an unremarkable room where even a careful ear would learn nothing. He understood that dullness was his best defense. When he died in 1984, the routine didn't stop. A son stepped in. Veterans held positions. In Connecticut, a tough underboss served as the day-to-day enforcer until he was murdered in 1989, a sign that the old balance was gone. That same year, thanks to an insider who wore a wire and guided agents to a quiet house in Massachusetts, the FBI recorded a formal initiation for the organization he had shaped. The tape captured oaths and the cadence of a ritual that had lived in whispers for a century. The sound undercut mythology by making the secret sound ordinary men in a room speaking promises that jurors could weigh like any other evidence. Those voices did not include his. He had been gone 5 years. But the structure in their words was the one he set. Hierarchy, permission, tribute, discipline. You can chart his effect by watching how the city behaved under pressure. Providence, under his rules, valued schedules and calm. He created incentives to keep rivalries contained. He forged practical compacts with Irish crews in Boston, trading boundaries and percentages for peace. He kept narcotics at arm's length near his routes to avoid federal storms. He treated baptisms, weddings, and funerals as neutral ground, and punished men who forgot. He invested in goodwill gestures that weren't generous so much as strategic. A turkey at a holiday, a quiet contribution after a neighbor's surgery, a phone call that moved a permit from the bottom of a stack to the top. These gestures cost little and bought something priceless. Acceptance that his way was the way. The criminal record tied to his years at the chair is plain. He oversaw illegal gambling across multiple states, organized loans at terms that trapped borrowers, extorted businesses while calling it protection, arranged theft and resale of freight, steered contracts and job assignments by pressuring unions and contractors, traded small bribes and favors for official delay, access, and reduced scrutiny, and approved violence, including killings, to maintain profit and order. He fought prosecutions with lawyers, health records, and appeals, winning when courts agreed that police had crossed constitutional lines, and losing when witnesses and tapes were strong and lawfully gathered. He avoided narcotics not because he was kinder than peers, but because he understood how quickly that line could melt the rest of the enterprise. The legacy is neither neat nor flattering. Some old-timers claim a neighborhood felt safer when someone was in charge. That belief confuses quiet with health. The quiet he curated rested on pressure. Bar owners paying to avoid problems, gamblers stuck in cycles they could not escape, workers whose schedules turned into favors, families who lived with worry through months, when the knock on the door might be a collector calling in a debt. His routines lulled a city into thinking crime could be managed like trash collection, predictable and out of sight. The reality was harm, spread thin enough to seem normal. He also left a legal map. Investigators and attorneys still study the cases that touched him to learn how to do things right and what happens when they don't. The decision that tossed the Rhode Island recordings affirmed that even a powerful target cannot justify unlawful intrusion. The Boston tapes proved how decisive a patient, lawful wire can be when agents understand language and context. The wrongful convictions in the Chelsea case taught the cost of building prosecutions around compromised testimony. These lessons travel far beyond Providence. They shape how cases are built in cities that never heard his name. Walk the Hill today, and his era feels close only in the small habits that linger. A coffee shop where older men still lower their voices for certain topics. A delivery truck that always seems to arrive early to the same back door. A club where faces change but rituals don't. His office is no longer the office. The city has a new rhythm and fresh headlines. But the idea he planted, the belief that crime thrives when it looks like ordinary business, remains a caution. People will tolerate almost anything if it happens softly, on time, and out of view. The man at the center of this story kept his tone mild while directing an organization that fed on other people's bad decisions and limited choices. He used calm to mask coercion and steadiness to make theft look like policy. He built a regional order that stayed intact through wars in other cities, precisely because he refused to stage one. He did not consider himself a hero or a villain. He considered himself effective. The neighborhoods he shaped still tally the costs of that effectiveness. If you want to understand him, picture the small details. The pen aligned with the edge of a paper blotter. The ring of a phone answered on the second sound. The way he waited for a visitor to say one word too many and then ended the meeting. The cardigan instead of a flashy suit. The oxygen tank at his side, the hiss barely louder than his breath. The old storefront that hid a regional economy in plain sight. He preferred small rooms because small rooms keep secrets. For a very long time, that preference worked. It made money. It managed feuds. It kept headlines from turning into dents in the ledger. In the end, the same preference limited him. When microphones shrank and insiders began to talk, no room was small enough. He left behind a system built on permission, tribute, and routine. His son, and then others, tried to run it by the same clock. The world outside the office, though, had changed more laws that fit the conduct, better tools to monitor it, and fewer men willing to keep a lifetime silence. The machine he built ground on for a while, then sputtered. What remains is the memory of how one person's discipline can bend a region toward quiet theft, and the reminder that order, when it stands on fear, is not order at all. It is simply another way to take, disguised as the hum of a normal day. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Raymond Patriarca here, thanking you for joining me in this quiet reflection on power, loyalty, and control. If this story helped you relax or drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Over 90% of our viewers watch, but haven't subscribed yet, so if you enjoyed this one, your subscription truly helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.